In January 2026, something is unfolding that could reshape the world. The most powerful nation in human history, a country that has dominated global trade, technology, and military influence for decades, is facing a moment of reckoning. A nation whose currency has underpinned global finance for nearly a century now stands on the edge of vulnerability, not from a conventional enemy, not from foreign armies, but from the invisible forces of debt, overreach, and economic imbalance. On this unseen battlefield, creditors, markets, and international institutions hold the levers of power. A shift in confidence, a sudden refusal to fund unsustainable policies, could topple the illusion of supremacy. America, like Britain in 1956, has built a global empire not just with arms, but with currency, influence, and networks of obligation. But for decades, warning signs have been ignored, deficits have grown, and spending has outpaced production. The foundations that sustained dominance are cracking beneath the surface, and now the consequences that leaders have postponed for so long are beginning to converge. This is not a distant theory or an abstract risk, it is a potential reality staring us in the face. The patterns are clear, the parallels undeniable. The choices of the past echo in the present, and the future may depend on whether we learn from them or repeat them. By the time the crisis strikes, it may already be too late. Let me guide you through exactly how America is walking the same path. Britain once did, and why 2026 may be the moment history rhymes, because when you step back and look at the pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore. America, the world's preeminent superpower, has built an empire not just on military might, but on financial influence, global institutions, and a currency the world has come to trust. The dollar is not just money, it is power. For decades, every major commodity, every international loan, every trade agreement has revolved around it. This has given the United States unparalleled leverage, the ability to fund wars, to borrow trillions at historically low interest rates, to dictate terms to other nations without firing a single shot. But that same power has bred complacency, overconfidence, and a dangerous sense of invulnerability. Sound familiar? It's so. The story of Britain in the 20th century echoes here, but with new variables, sharper stakes, and an economy more intertwined with global finance than ever before. Let's start with the numbers, because numbers never lie. America's national debt now exceeds $33 trillion. Interests on that debt alone consumes over 15% of federal revenue annually, and that number is projected to climb. The United States runs a trade deficit of more than $1 trillion a year, importing far more than it produces. For decades, policymakers have relied on the world's continued demand for dollars to mask structural weaknesses. China, Japan, and other major holders of treasury bonds have, until recently, maintained their faith, but cracks are appearing. The demand for dollars is slowing. Foreign central banks are diversifying reserves into euros, yuan, and even crypto. Petrodollars, once a guarantee that global oil would flow through U.S.-controlled financial corridors, are now under challenge as countries explore alternative settlement systems. Domestically, the picture is just as alarming. Manufacturing, once the backbone of American economic dominance, has been hollowed out. Factories shuttered, supply chains offshored, innovation increasingly tied to intellectual property rather than production. The United States produces a fraction of the goods it consumes, relying on other countries to meet the needs of its population. This mirrors Britain's late 19th century over-reliance on global trade and reserves. But the scale today is unprecedented. If confidence in the dollar falters, shortages and inflation could arrive faster than anyone anticipates. Even military spending mirrors Britain's mistakes. America maintains over 750 military bases in more than 80 countries, far exceeding Britain's imperial footprint. The annual defense budget eclipses the next 9 nations combined, but military might cannot pay the bills. Britain attempted to prop up an empire it could no longer afford, and the illusion of power lasted only until creditors and markets demanded reality. America, too, relies on a borrowed illusion. Every day, the United States issues $7 billion in new debt to cover existing obligations. Every year, deficits accumulate faster than the economy grows, and the political system continues to treat this as normal, promising new spending programs while avoiding tough decisions on taxation, entitlements, and fiscal responsibility. Geopolitically, the U.S. is facing an increasingly multipolar world. Russia and China conduct trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar when convenient. BRICS nations are building parallel financial systems, and even traditional allies are quietly hedging against dollar risk. Sanctions, once the most powerful tool in the U.S. arsenal, are losing efficacy because nations no longer feel dependent on American banking. America's influence is no longer automatic. It is conditional, fragile, and subject to the same forces that once toppled Britain. The parallels are striking. Structural debt, overextended military, dependence on global trust, and a refusal to acknowledge systemic risk. But the differences are what make this story more dangerous. America's economy is larger, more complex, and more integrated into the global system than Britain's ever was. A sudden crisis could cascade through markets in minutes rather than years. A political deadlock over debt ceilings or interest payments could trigger immediate market panic. Unlike Britain, where the fall was measured in months and years before the Suez collapse, technology adds another dimension. Rapid capital flows, automated trading, and globalized finance mean that confidence and the loss of it can travel at the speed of light. And yet, warnings have been ignored. Economists across the political spectrum, former Treasury officials, Federal Reserve chairs, and international financial institutions have repeatedly cautioned that current trajectories are unsustainable. Every warning is met with political deflection, partisan bickering, and the comforting myth that this time is different. Every empire that fell believed the same thing. Every reserve currency that collapsed was supported by faith, until suddenly it was not. The United States is repeating the same patterns that led to Britain's fall, but in a world where the stakes are higher, the speed of collapse could be faster, and the consequences more devastating. The cracks are no longer hypothetical. U.S. infrastructure, trade balances, energy independence, and industrial output are all under strain. Social cohesion is fraying under inequality, debt, and inflationary pressures. Confidence in institutions is weakening. Britain ignored warning signs for decades, convinced that reputation would substitute for reality. America appears to be doing the same, relying on past victories, economic, military, and technological to justify policies that may no longer be sustainable. Now, consider the consequences if the illusion of endless power and unlimited credit begins to crumble. Britain's final decades were defined by a slow accumulation of debt, overconfidence in its global position, and the belief that its empire would compensate for any weakness. America today mirrors that pattern, but on a global stage, exponentially larger and more interconnected. The nation spends more than it produces, borrows more than it earns, and assumes that the world's reliance on the dollar will indefinitely cover structural imbalances. Every $1 trillion added to the national debt, every factory offshored, every unfunded entitlement program is another brick in a wall of vulnerability. And while the U.S. government continues to promise stability, markets, foreign creditors, and ordinary citizens are the ones paying attention, and they are beginning to see the cracks. Take interest rates as an example. In 2026, projections indicate that interest payments alone could exceed $1 trillion annually, surpassing what the federal government spends on defense or major social programs. That equivalent to a household so buried in credit card debt that the minimum payments consume most of the paycheck. Britain faced a similar reality after World War II. Debt obligations far outpaced revenue, forcing choices between spending on empire or survival. America's choices echo that same dilemma, but magnified by the scale of the global economy and the speed of modern financial markets. Confidence, once lost, could evaporate in days, not years. Meanwhile, international power dynamics are shifting. China's Belt and Road Initiative, digital yuan development, and currency swap agreements are reducing dollar dependence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Russia and China are creating parallel payment systems to circumvent American sanctions. Even Europe, historically aligned with the U.S., is exploring independent financial mechanisms to reduce exposure to treasury bonds. This undermines the long-standing advantage that America has enjoyed as the issuer of the world's reserve currency, an advantage that Britain once had with the pound. America's military overreach compounds the problem. Over 750 bases worldwide, engagements in multiple regions, and reliance on credit to sustain global operations are reminiscent of Britain's empire, which maintained military outposts across continents it could no longer afford. America is not yet bankrupt in the traditional sense, but the gap between obligations and available resources is widening rapidly. Britain's Suez Moment came not because of a lack of force, but because it had lost financial credibility. The U.S. faces the same risk. No amount of military hardware can substitute for solvency. No number of troops can enforce confidence in a currency. Domestically, inequality and debt amplify the fragility. Household debt in America is at record levels. Mortgages, car loans, and credit card balances stretch incomes, and inflationary pressures reduce real purchasing power. When the dollar's reserve status is challenged, these pressures will magnify, hitting ordinary citizens first and hardest. Britain's citizens lost savings, saw inflation spike, and endured shortages. America's middle class could face similar shocks, perhaps even more swiftly given globalized supply chains and automated financial systems. Political denial mirrors Britain's final decades. Policymakers promise tax cuts and spending programs without addressing structural deficits. Public expectations are divorced from fiscal reality. Those who warn about debt and economic imbalance are dismissed as alarmists. This is the same mindset that delayed Britain's necessary reforms until it was too late. History does not care about good intentions, political affiliations, or national pride. It only responds to the hard truths of numbers, debt, and global confidence. But there is still a critical difference. America can act. Britain ignored warnings for decades, constrained by empire, tradition, and national ego. The U.S., for all its faults, has tools and options that Britain never did. A large, innovative economy, technological leadership, global alliances, and the ability to reform fiscal policy if political will aligns. The question is whether leaders and citizens recognize the magnitude of risk before it becomes a crisis that markets, foreign powers, or geopolitical rivals exploit. What does this mean for individuals? It means preparation matters. Those who diversify savings, invest in tangible assets, develop skills, and maintain resilience will fare better in the coming turbulence. History teaches that ordinary people often bear the brunt of systemic failures, while the institutions and elites recover or reposition themselves. Britain's middle class faced a rapid decline in living standards in the post-war years. America's citizens could experience a similar shock if confidence in the dollar falters. Finally, consider the timing. Britain's collapse appeared gradual, then happened almost overnight with the Suez Crisis. America's trajectory has been building for decades. Trade deficits since the 1970s, offshoring of industry, debt accumulation post-2008, and record spending during the pandemic era. Each year without reform compounds risk. A single event, a geopolitical conflict, a financial panic, a debt ceiling standoff could act as the catalyst. The difference today is speed. Markets move faster, capital flows are instantaneous, and global interdependence ensures that any shock in the U.S. economy would ripple worldwide. The consequences would not be confined to America. They would be felt globally, echoing the fall of Britain, but on a much larger, faster scale. The parallels are haunting, yet the lessons remain clear. Structural debt, overextended military, reliance on confidence, and denial of reality were Britain's mistakes. America is repeating them, but with stakes far higher and risks far faster. Ignoring these warning signs is a choice, not fate. History offers a roadmap, one that can guide action if Americans choose to see the pattern, understand the numbers, and act decisively before the moment of reckoning arrives. Same reckless spending, same overextended military, same hubris, same disregard for warning signs, same refusal to confront reality. The United States is repeating the British Empire's final mistake, believing it is untouchable. We are living in the echo of history, following paths that could lead to sudden collapse. Most people remain unaware, distracted by comfort and routine, blind to the storm building beneath the surface. The question is not if, but when we will face our Suez moment. Will we act before it's too late, or will 2026 become America ese 1956? Stay vigilant. Subscribe Wealth Casebook.